The United States likes to boast that it's the world's leading democracy, and it likes to preach to other countries how they can be more democratic. The idea is pretty simple. Voters choose their leaders. But the truth is that in the United States, a lot of leaders choose their voters. That's right, a lot of elected officials get to choose who it is who's actually going to cast their ballots on voting day, virtually guaranteeing victory. They do it by manipulating shapes on maps. It's very common, it's very legal, and there's very little most people can do about it. There's a funny word for it that's drawn from the name of a 19th century politician who wanted to basically fix the outcome of an election in the Boston area. His name was Elbridge Gerry, and Mr. Gerry created a voting district that looked a bit like a reptile, a salamander. Gerry's salamander became gerrymander, and gerrymandering became an American tradition. Sam Wong from Princeton University joins us now to talk more about it. And let me just ask you, first of all, to think about it this way, it's almost like the U.S. political system is in part like a Las Vegas casino. The rules are very clear, and they just tend to favor the House most of the time.
Well, the way I would put it is that it is exactly the case that in many states, legislatures draw district lines, and those legislators then can run for office under the lines that they themselves draw. So they set the rules. And I guess in that respect, it's like a house, in your analogy, the house wins. And the House draws its own lines, runs under its own rules. And so in most states in the United States, that's the way it goes. And then there are ways in which people are attempting to change that.
Well, let's just be very clear about this. This doesn't really operate at a national level because the map of the United States is pretty clear and the president runs in the whole country. There are oddities to the way that's done, but at the presidential level, this isn't really an issue. At the level of senators who run for election in their entire state, it's not really an issue. It tends to come down to the House of Representatives because representatives run in individual districts within states, and I guess that's where the mischief really happens.
That's right. So in the American system of government, we have federalism where government is controlled at a variety of levels, whether national, state, and local. And because of that national, state, and local level of organization, there's a lot of local standards by which things are done. And so in the case of the Senate or the presidency, those are determined by voting that occurs at a statewide level. So the presidential race is determined by a thing called the Electoral College, which is the outcome of every state's election one by one across the 50 states. Senate elections, simple. Whoever gets more votes becomes the senator from that state, one of two senators. But yes, the House of Representatives, that is something where every state has a different set of rules by which it draws the districts. And in states where the legislature is in charge, the party that's in charge will have a natural impulse to draw district lines that are favorable to their own party.
How does that work? How does a party in power create districts with the expectation that they'll get reelected simply because of the shapes on the map?
Well, the way it works is this. In the United States, partisan polarization is quite high. Over the last 20 years, people have become more and more habitual and tribal in the way that they vote. And so it's possible to predict how a person votes from election to election. It's unusual for people to switch from Democratic to Republican in their preference. The great majority of voters have predictable patterns. These patterns are publicly available, so it's possible to get them. And using inexpensive, and actually in one case free, map drawing software, it is possible to take that information, draw lines, and create a map that is favorable to that can generate outcomes in short order that predetermine the outcome in every district if the person drawing the lines so chooses.
So basically, if you want to get a lot of Republicans to vote for you, you choose map lines that put a lot of Republicans in your district. If you want to make sure that Democrats don't vote against you, you choose map lines that basically exclude them, put them on the other side of that border.
Right. So there are tactics that the tactics have names like cracking and packing. So if you don't like your opponents, you want your opponents to be packed into as few districts as possible. So you create a district where your opponents vote, say, 70-30 or 80-20. And then you can, in that way, cram them into as few districts as possible. Another thing you can do is you can take people who you would like not to have power and crack them. And so take the remainder of their voters and draw lines right down the middle, so that they, in fact, are able to elect nobody at all. And that's called cracking. And these two tactics, cracking and packing, are this art form where, honestly, it's not rocket science. A hobbyist with a laptop can crack and pack. And so it doesn't take anything more than lack of compunction. That's what it takes.
And it's legal. That's the amazing thing. I mean, the courts are often called on to talk about this, to rule on it. Mostly they let it go.
That's right. Federal courts have declined to intervene in partisan gerrymandering. So there's different ways to gerrymander. One is to make one person safe. One is to exclude or empower one racial group. But one major form of gerrymandering, which is partisan gerrymandering, the U.S. Supreme Court has declined to intervene, and they've left it to individual states. And what that means is individual states have left it to their own devices. So, the ways that you can stop this are a court can step in, or the voters of a state can vote to change their constitution to outlaw it, which does happen, or the governor can veto a bad plan. So there are ways of doing it, but those ways of stopping gerrymandering are carried out state by state. It's a local battle. It's like there's an online meme. It's like rather than fighting a duck-sized horse, rather than fighting a horse-sized duck, we're fighting 50 duck-sized horses. So like 50 little battles all over the United States.
And you end up, I guess, with some pretty weird shapes. I'm thinking about the 35th Congressional District in Texas. And I don't mean to quiz you on it, but essentially it's San Antonio, which is heavily Democratic, and Austin, which is heavily Democratic, and really aren't anywhere near each other. But to put all the Democrats into one district, they're connected by a tiny land bridge. Now, that district alone has been to court, I think, 3 different times, and 3 different courts had to come down and say, well, pretty legal overall, but it was actually the only basis for the court case was on the basis of race. The idea that there was this weird-shaped district was perfectly kosher.
That's right. The Voting Rights Act in the United States does protect classifying voters based on race. And so there are court protections on those grounds. But drawing a district for partisan reasons or for most other reasons is perfectly permissible. And like you say, San Antonio and Austin are hundreds of miles apart. They are predominantly Democratic. And so if you want to minimize the power of voters in those districts, you want to draw a district that's like a dumbbell where Austin's up here, San Antonio's down here, and you just create a slender spit of land. And it's possible in cases, there are districts across America where these spits of land go along interstate highways. And so it's almost literally the case that you can drive down the highway, if you're a politician, open up your car doors and reach out both sides and meet all your constituents. So these are crazy, crazy shapes, but they are not illegal.
What does this do to democracy in America?
Well, what it does is it creates districts that are not responsive to the will of the voters. Because people are habitual in their voting habits and because people who are of similar political mind tend to live together, already most districts in the United States are not very competitive. But what gerrymandering does is it removes what little competition is left in the system. So it insulates politicians from their voters. That means that the only election that matters is the primary. Because remember, in the United States, we have a primary system where people compete to be the nominee of a party, and then that nominee goes on to the general election. And so the primary is the only election that matters. What that means is that voters within a party end up having all the say. And so the most vocal members of the Democratic Party or the most vocal members of the Republican Party who will stick together can have an outsized say in who represents them. And consequently, you end up with people who are elected by the most loyal voters, by the most habitual voters, representing either party, whether it be in the legislature or in Congress. And so, that's one thing that comes out. Another thing that comes out is that it's possible for one party to insulate itself. Up until very recently, in the state of Wisconsin, a minority of Republican voters was capable of electing not just a majority in the state legislature, but a supermajority. 49% of voters in Wisconsin, if they vote Republican, were enough to elect over 2/3 of the members of the legislature and evade the governor's veto. And so it's possible to engineer outcomes not only for one person, but for an entire chamber of government. And so consequently, it's possible for an entire legislature to be insulated from voters' opinions.
This just seems crazy and wrong and permanent. Is there any prospect of this going away?
It is a battle of inches. Despite the terribleness of partisan gerrymandering, there are solutions. The solution is to find ways to check the power of the legislature. And so consequently, you can have, for instance, in about half of the United States, voters have the power to amend the Constitution by direct vote. And so in Michigan, in Colorado, in California, in Arizona, citizen commissions are formed, and they act like juries. They form once, they meet once for a period of weeks or months, and they redraw the map themselves, and they are not politicians. So that's one way of doing it. Another way is to find a state court that is willing to intervene, and that has happened in a few states. There are state courts in Pennsylvania, in New Mexico, and other places that have said, okay, within our state constitutions, which are little miniature versions of the U.S. federal constitution, they say within our constitution we are willing to cabin off gerrymandering. And looking inside the Wisconsin Constitution, the Wisconsin Supreme Court was willing to do that. And that's why there are some shoots of green appearing here and there. There's some good news around the country. Wisconsin has a fairer map than it had last year because of court action. Michigan has a fairer map than it did 10 years ago because of citizen action. So there are solutions, but you know, it's this battle of fighting little teeny tiny wars all over the country.
Because the bottom line is, I guess, the people elected under this system seem to like it.
They do. People don't like to give up power. That is a natural impulse. And you can well imagine even the best intentioned of legislators would have a hard time resisting the temptation to keep themselves in power.
Sam Wong, thanks very much.